I yield the floor.
I rise to speak about the nomination of William Barr to be the next Attorney General of the United States. Mr. Barr has an admirable record of public service in his career. He has dramatically more qualifications and experience than many of his predecessors, and certainly even the acting Attorney General would concede he brings more experience to the job. I respect Mr. Barr and his family. I've told him as much to his face. He has a wonderful family, and he brought them with him to the hearing. And many of them have chosen public careers as he has. I carefully reviewed his record, trying to consider him in not only the context of this awesome responsibility of being Attorney General, but at this awesome moment in history. When it comes to the ongoing investigation of President Trump's campaign by Robert Mueller, I fear that Mr. Barr has said and done things which raise questions about his objectivity. He has clearly indicated to President Donald Trump and to all of us how he would oversee this investigation if he is confirmed. Just look at the unsolicited 19-page memo that William Barr sent to Special Counsel Mueller's supervisors and to the Trump legal defense team just last June 2018. It's notable that Mr. Barr did not send this memo to Special Counsel Mueller himself, and he did not make it public. This was the only time Mr. Barr had sent a memo like this to the Justice Department, and he did not disclose in his memo that he had personally interviewed with the president's attorneys the previous year about serving on the president's defense team. This memo is critical for its substance. In it, Mr. Barr argued that Bob Mueller, the investigator, the special counsel, should not be permitted to ask the president any questions about obstruction of justice, even though Mr. Barr's analysis only focused on one narrow obstruction theory. The memo calls into serious question Mr. Barr's ability to impartially oversee the obstruction of justice issues in the Mueller investigation at a moment in history when that is an essential question. And Mr. Barr has made no commitment to recuse himself from such questions. That's worrisome. That William Barr would volunteer a 19-page legal memo with dramatic efforts at research and verification, give this to the president's defense team and to the Department of Justice, and basically make arguments diminishing the authority of the special counsel to move forward in the investigation, raises a serious question about his impartiality. Just as important, I'm alarmed by Mr. Barr's continued hedging about what he will do when Mr. Mueller completes his investigation and has a presentation of his conclusions, his evidence, and his findings. Make no mistake, Special Counsel Mueller's findings and conclusions should be shared with the American people and with the United States Congress. Current regulations at the Department of Justice and policies allow for such a release. I'm concerned that Mr. Barr will exercise his discretion under those regulations and do it narrowly and issue a cursory report that does not take the findings of the Mueller investigation in their entirety and make them available to the American people. This investigation is too critical to seal its result in some vault at the Department of Justice. I believe we can trust Bob Mueller to be impartial and unbiased. I don't know if he will find that the president or people around him are guilty of wrongdoing beyond the indictments and convictions that have already come down, or whether he'll conclude that there is no responsibility or culpability. But I trust his findings, whatever they are. He's a true professional. It's important, after we've gone through more than a year or two of investigation, that the American people hear the details and hear the information that may be part of the Mueller investigation. I'm also concerned that Mr. Barr will continue his predecessor's harsh approach on immigration instead of charting a different course. It was just last year, I believe in March in 2018, when the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced something called the zero tolerance policy. Do you remember it? The zero tolerance policy said that the United States government would forcibly remove infants, toddlers, and children from their parents at our border. And Inspector General's reports say that it had been going on for a year before it was publicly announced. 2,800 children were removed from their parents. What happened to them next is shameful. We don't know what happened to them next. There was no effort made to trace these children and the parents who were forced to give them up. It was only when a federal judge in San Diego stepped forward and required the Department of Homeland Security to make an accounting of how many children were still not united with their parents that they took the effort to do so. Months after those children had been separated from their parents. I saw those kids in an immigration court in Chicago, in a building, a large office building that you'd never guess was a court building, in the Loop in Chicago. There it was, the immigration court, taking up most of one floor in this office building. People were stacked 3 and 4 deep in the corridors waiting for their hearing. But the judge, and she was a good person, a real professional, the judge couldn't get her hearing underway. She had a problem with those who were appearing before her court that day. The problem was this: she had said that before they could start the proceeding, that those who were appearing had to sit down. One of the clients who was in there for a hearing that day had some difficulty. I was there to witness it. The difficulty was she was 2 years old. She wasn't tall enough to crawl up in that chair without somebody lifting her. The other client who had a hearing that day, who had been removed under this zero tolerance policy, he was a little more skillful. He spotted a Matchbox car on top of the table, and this 4-year-old boy got up in the chair to play with it. Those were 2 of the clients before this immigration judge in this office building in the Loop in Chicago. They had been forcibly removed from their parents, and they were up for a hearing. It was in July. And as a result of the hearing, as with most of the hearings, they said, we're going to postpone this till we get further evidence. The next hearing will be in December. December. I'd ask any parent, any grandparent, what would you think about being separated from that little girl, that 2-year-old girl that you love so much, for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months? That was the policy of this Trump administration with zero tolerance, a policy created and announced by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. So when I asked Mr. Barr, you're going to take over this job, what is your view on this type of policy? Sadly, I didn't get a direct answer. I am concerned that in many respects, Mr. Barr could continue the harsh approach to immigration, which we've seen by the Trump administration, instead of charting a different course, a course more consistent with America's values and history. We are, in fact, a nation of immigrants. Throughout American history, immigration has strengthened and renewed our country. I stand here today, the son of an immigrant girl who came to this country at the age of 2 from Lithuania. Her son grew up and got a full-time government job right here in the Senate. It can happen. It's my story, it's my family's story, it's America's story. And when I listen to the diatribes by this president in his State of the Union address about immigrants coming to this country, of course they're bad people. We don't want any of them in this country. And if they're here, we want them to leave. But think of all the good people who've come to this country and made America what it is today. The president dismisses those folks, doesn't take them as seriously as he should, as far as I'm concerned. I want to know if this Attorney General, Mr. Barr, subscribes to the president's theories on immigration. For the past 2 years, President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions did everything in their power to make America's immigration policy harsh and unwelcoming. Mr. Barr's comments and history make me fear he'll bring the full weight of the Justice Department to advance the president's anti-immigration agenda. Mr. Barr has refused to disavow the cruel and un-American zero-tolerance policy which I just described that led to thousands of children being forcibly removed from their parents. And he's fully and repeatedly echoed President Trump's call for a border wall after the debate we've been through over the last several months, falsely arguing that it will help combat the opioid epidemic. That is a ludicrous argument. In fact, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which Mr. Barr would supervise, has found that the vast majority of deadly narcotics coming into America through the Mexican border are coming in through ports of entry. They're not being carried in backpacks by people scaling fences. That's where our security efforts should be made, not with some medieval wall. Mr. Barr also falsely and repeatedly was critical of our asylum laws for a host of problems. Our asylum laws, which have historically had broad bipartisan support until this president came along, simply ensure that we honor our legal and moral obligation to provide safe haven to families and children who are fleeing persecution. Who are these families seeking asylum and refugee status in the United States? Well, you can find members of those families right here on the floor of the United States Senate. You can find 3 Cuban-American United States senators, 1 Democrat and 2 Republicans, whose families came here as refugees from Castro's Cuba. Are we having second thoughts now about whether they are a valuable part of America? I'm not. These people, these Cuban Americans, have become an integral part of our nation. They were once refugees and asylees. Now, they are part of America and its future, and we're better off for it. I could tell that story so many different ways. Soviet Jews trying to escape persecution in the old Soviet Union. The Vietnamese who stood by us and fought by our men and women in uniform during the Vietnam War, who had to escape an oppressive regime, came to the United States as refugees and asylees. We are now seeing under President Trump the lowest level of refugees in modern memory. We are walking away from our obligation to the world. And Mr. Barr called for withholding of federal funds to force cities to cooperate with the Trump administration's immigration agenda, even though courts have repeatedly struck down that approach. Perhaps most troubling was Mr. Barr's comment to me that he thinks it's absolutely appropriate for the Attorney General to change the immigration rules to help advance a president's campaign. He said it at the time to help in the campaign of President Bush in 1992. The idea of an Attorney General letting campaign politics drive immigration enforcement is unacceptable, regardless of the president. I'm also concerned with the views Mr. Barr expressed on something known as the unitary executive theory, an expansive view of presidential power. He put it bluntly in that 19-page memo I mentioned before. He said we need an Attorney General who recognizes the need for checks and balances, but he did not believe that this president should be held accountable for many of the actions he's taken. Mr. President may be naive, but I don't believe any American is above the law, including the President of the United States. This is not an ordinary time in the history of the Justice Department. President Trump has criticized the judiciary, individual federal judges, our intelligence agencies, and the Department of Justice when it continued an investigation into his campaign. He's undermined their independence and integrity with his storm of tweets every single day. William Barr said he sees the Attorney General as the president's lawyer, in his words. But the chief law enforcement of the United States is supposed to be the lawyer for the people of the United States. We need an Attorney General who will lead the Justice Department without fear or favor, and who will serve the Constitution and the American people, even if it means standing up to a president. If he's confirmed, I hope Mr. Barr will prove me wrong, and that he will be a good Attorney General who came at the right moment in history. But I have not received the reassurances I was looking for from him to give him a vote to reach that position. I will be voting no on the Barr nomination. Mr. President, I see my colleague and friend, Senator Leahy, on the floor. I will withhold the 2 other statements for the record to yield the floor to him.
Vermont. President, I applaud the senator from Illinois, the senior senator from Illinois, for his comments. And he knows what it is to have immigrants in your family, as I do. I was fortunate that we're a little bit more understanding when my maternal grandparents immigrated to Vermont from Italy, or my wife's parents immigrated to Vermont from French-speaking Canada. I still struggle with the Italian I knew as a child, a little bit better with the French I had to know to speak to Marcel's family. But I see the diversity that came from it, and I see our state of Vermont, and I hope our country better for it. So I thank the senator from Illinois. You know, Mr. President, the last time William Barr was before the Senate, that's 28 years ago, during the George H.W. Bush administration, and I voted for him to be Attorney General. I did so despite having some reservations that I shared with him in the Senate at the time. Mr. Barr and I did not see eye to eye on many issues. We did not then, we do not now. But he was clearly qualified for the position, and he earned the confidence of the Senate. So I felt free to vote for him. I am concerned by some of the remarks, and Senator Durbin has referred to it, which seems to indicate that Mr. Barr may feel that he's the lawyer for the president. No, he's the Attorney General of the United States. He's there to represent everybody, to make sure the laws are upheld for everybody. So now we find ourselves considering his nomination under extraordinarily different circumstances than we did when my friend President Bush had nominated him. Multiple criminal investigations loom over the Trump presidency. In fact, these investigations may ultimately define the Trump presidency, and the president has reacted to them apparently the only way he knows how. He just attacks relentlessly. Doesn't respond to them, but attacks. That includes attacking investigators or witnesses. He even attacks the justice system of America itself. That includes firing both an FBI director and his previous attorney general for not handling one of the investigations as the president wanted instead of as the law required. The president views the Justice Department as an extension of his power, ready to politicize it. He's repeatedly called on it to target his political opponents. He's even reportedly told his advisors he expects the Attorney General to protect him personally. I've been here with 8 presidents. I've never known a president, either Republican or Democrat, to have such an outrageous and wrong view of the Department of Justice. In fact, the integrity of the Justice Department has not been so tested since the dark days of Watergate. But when the Judiciary Committee considered the nomination of Elliot Richardson to be Attorney General in the midst of that national crisis, nominated by Richard Nixon, the nominee made numerous detailed commitments to the committee. Mr. Richardson did so, in his words, to create the maximum possible degree of public confidence in the integrity of the process. Well, the same principle applies equally today. Indeed, that may be the only way the Justice Department escapes the Trump administration with its integrity intact, in large part due to the relentless politicizing of the department by the president. Millions of Americans will see bias no matter which way the department resolves the Russia investigation. And because of them seeing such bias, our country is diminished. The justice system is greatly diminished. In my view, the department has only one way out: transparency. The American people deserve to know the facts, whichever way they go. That requires that the special counsel's report and the evidence that supports be made public. Unfortunately, despite efforts from both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, Mr. Barr has repeatedly refused to make that commitment. Worse, much of his testimony before the Judiciary Committee left us with more doubts. Will Mr. Barr allow President Trump to make a sweeping, unprecedented claim of executive privilege that allows him to hide the report? Will Mr. Barr, relying on a department policy to avoid disparaging uncharged parties, not disclose potential misconduct by the president simply due to another policy to not indict sitting presidents? We don't know the answer. But we do know that Mr. Barr's testimony on these issues could lay the groundwork for potentially no transparency at all. Mr. Barr also repeatedly refused to follow the precedent of Attorney General Jeff Sessions and commit to follow the advice of career ethics officials on whether he needs to recuse himself from the Russia investigation. He even declined my request to commit to simply sharing their recommendation with the Judiciary Committee. And that's critical, because there is reason to question whether an appearance of a conflict exists. Now, prior to his nomination, Mr. Barr made his unorthodox views on the special counsel's obstruction of justice investigation very clear. He did that with a 19-page memo sent directly to the president's lawyers. And Mr. Barr spoke dismissively about the broader Russia investigation, even claiming that a conspiracy theory involving Hillary Clinton was far more deserving of a federal investigation than possible collusion. This notwithstanding the fact that by that time, that conspiracy had been debunked. Now, he was asked whether, in effect, whether this memo was a job application, because it is difficult to imagine these views escape the attention of the president. And that makes it all the more critical that Mr. Barr follow the precedent of prior attorneys general and commit to following the advice of career ethics officials on recusal. And I'm also concerned that if confirmed, Mr. Barr would defend policies that I believe are both ineffective and inhumane. We heard Senator Durbin speak eloquently about the horrible program of separating families at the border. And I think the nation is still reeling from that systematic separation. But in light of that, Mr. Barr praised Jeff Sessions for breaking the record for prosecution of the misdemeanor offenses that force families to be separated. In other words, on a misdemeanor, you can take the child away from the parents and separate them. Nobody seems to know where everybody goes after that. Ask a 4-year-old, what's your parents' name? They'll say in whatever their language is, mommy and daddy. Well, where do you live? Well, we live in the house next to so-and-so. They don't know the addresses. They rely on their parents, and now they've been separated from them. It makes me think that attorneys general should be able to stand up for the rule of law. I remember a time when former acting Attorney General Sally Yates stood up for the rule of law. She refused to defend President Trump's first iteration of his Muslim ban as a deeply flawed order It was stained with racial animus that even applied to individuals who were lawful permanent residents and had valid visas. But Mr. Barr described Ms. Yates' decision as obstruction and a serious abuse of office. This country should not have religious tests. My God. If we did, my grandparents would not have been able to come to this country. So relevant to each of my concerns is the fact that Mr. Barr has extremely broad views of executive power. He's an advocate of the unitary executive theory, believing that the Constitution vests nearly all executive power in one and one only person, the President. He has said that an Attorney General thus has no authority, no conceivable justification for directing the department's lawyers not to advocate the President's position in court. This expansive view of a President's power would confirm me no matter who the administration was. In fact, it conflicts when you go way back in history. Supreme Court Justice James Iredell's observation in 1792 that the Attorney General is not called the Attorney General of the President, but Attorney General of the United States. So I find Mr. Barr's deferential view of executive power especially concerning. We already know much of what President Trump tends to do. It includes taking billions of dollars that Congress has already appropriated, diverting it toward a wasteful, ineffective vanity wall, hoping that people will not realize that he'd given his word that Mexico would pay for it, and now he wants the American taxpayers to do it. What would Mr. Barr do when he's confronted with such an order? He essentially told us, he's argued that Congress appropriations power provided under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution is not an independent source of congressional power to control the allocation of government resources. That would come in great news to everybody, Republican and Democrat, has been an appropriator in any Congress. He even believes that if a president finds no appropriated funds within a given category, but can find such money in another category, he can spend those funds as he wishes so long as spending is within his broad constitutional purview. Kind of ignores Article 1, Section 9. And it should concern all of us here, Republicans and Democrats alike, who believe, as the founders of this country believed, that Congress possesses the power of the purse. Unfortunately, I fear that Mr. Barr's long-held views on executive power would essentially be weaponized by President Trump, a man who we know derides any limits on his authority. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the erosion of our institutional checks and balances in the face of creeping authoritarianism. That can't continue. So let me be clear in conclusion. I respect Mr. Barr. I voted for him when President George H.W. Bush nominated him. And I do not doubt that he, as Attorney General, would stand faithfully by his genuinely held convictions. But I fear this particular administration needs somebody who would give him a much tighter leash, as attorneys general have in the past. So because of that, I will vote no on Mr. Barr's nomination.
Mr.